For years, my land had been my sanctuary, 40 acres of peaceful, open pasture surrounded by rolling hills and clusters of oak trees that framed the horizon. The air always carried that subtle mix of earth, grass, and sunlight, and I had grown used to the rhythm of nature, the hum of crickets at dusk, the soft lowing of my bulls in the distance, the steady rustle of wind through the fence lines. It wasn't luxury, but it was mine. Every fence post, every blade of grass had been earned through sweat, patience, and stubbornness. When I first bought the property, there hadn't been a homeowners association anywhere near it. It was quiet country land, too far out for anyone to care. But as the years passed, developers crept in from the city. The open fields turned into cul-de-sacs, the barns into garages, and the rough gravel roads were slowly smoothed into perfect asphalt. That was when the HOA came, first as a promise of community improvement, and then as a silent chain around everyone's neck. They called themselves Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. It sounded pleasant enough. But behind that title was a small group of people who believed they owned everyone's property except their own. At the center of it all was a woman named Patricia, the kind of person who wore authority like perfume. She smiled like a politician but moved like a hawk circling prey. People in the neighborhood called her Karen behind closed doors, and for good reason. At first, she stayed away from my property. My land wasn't technically under their jurisdiction. The HOA boundary stopped a few hundred yards from my fence line, but my open space, my grazing bulls, my hay barn, they didn't fit the aesthetic she wanted for her neighborhood. To her, my land was an eyesore, something to be beautified. Few months were tolerable. Flyers were left in my mailbox, friendly reminders about keeping the area tidy, a few subtle hints about joining the HOA voluntarily. I ignored them. Then came the community events. Patricia organized them almost every weekend, outdoor brunches, picnics, neighborhood yoga sessions. The HOA park was small, though, and her events grew larger and louder with every new homeowner that moved in. Parking overflowed onto the edges of my property, tire marks scarring the grass near my gate. I still didn't react. I had lived long enough to know that some battles weren't worth fighting. I figured, let her host her potlucks and costume parades, as long as she stayed on her side of the fence. But that boundary, the one between her sense of ownership and my private land, was about to vanish completely. It started with a small note, handwritten in cursive and taped to my gate. It wasn't a request, it was an announcement. The HOA was hosting its annual community camping festival next month. The note said, "We will be using the open field adjacent to your property for temporary overnight stays. Please ensure the area is prepared." I read it twice, trying to process the absurdity. She wasn't asking for permission. She was telling me what would happen. My adjacent property was my fenced-in pasture, home to 6 fully grown bulls. It wasn't a public park. It wasn't even accessible without cutting the fence. And yet, she had already printed flyers, posted event details online, and sent group emails about 500 attendees expected for the weekend. First, I laughed. It had to be a mistake. No one would seriously plan to host hundreds of campers on someone else's private land. But when I drove by the neighborhood notice board a few days later, there it was, my land, photographed and labeled as community campgrounds. The week leading up to the event, things escalated fast. Trucks came by, measuring the field through binoculars. Volunteers appeared, hanging decorative ribbons on my fence, marking areas for tents, food trucks, and parking zones. I stood by the gate more than once, shaking my head in disbelief as they hammered stakes into the ground just outside my property. When I confronted them, they said they were acting under HOA authority. That was the moment I realized what Patricia truly believed, that because her neighborhood was growing, she thought she could absorb my land into it, that she could rewrite property lines through arrogance and confidence alone. I decided not to stop her immediately. Part of me wanted to see how far she would go. There's a strange calm that comes when you've been pushed too far. A silence before the thunder. I spent the following nights in my barn office, reviewing property maps, old deeds, and aerial photos. I double-checked every legal boundary, every inch of ownership. My fences were exactly where they should be. The HOA had no authority here. As the event drew closer, I watched the preparations unfold with quiet detachment. They brought in portable toilets, picnic tables, and even a small stage for live music. Flyers littered mailboxes across town, boasting 500 attendees, a weekend of fun under the stars. My field, my land, my sanctuary had become their party venue. The night before the event, I made my own preparations. I didn't plan on violence or confrontation, but I wasn't going to let anyone trample my property again. My bulls, strong, territorial creatures, had always stayed in the back pasture. That night, I opened the connecting gate, giving them full access to the front field. They were calm, well-trained, and knew the boundaries better than any human ever had. I stood there in the moonlight, hands resting on the fence, the herd grazing quietly behind me. The cool night breeze carried a sense of anticipation, the kind that hums just before a storm breaks. By morning, the HOA's army of volunteers arrived, followed by waves of cars, RVs, and tents. Excitement buzzed in the air as families unloaded their gear, laughing and chatting, oblivious to where they stood. Then, as the first line of campers crossed the fence to stake their tents, the bulls lifted their heads. And that was when the quiet finally ended. The morning sunlight spread across the pasture in streaks of gold, revealing the full scale of what the HOA had done. My once serene field was no longer a pasture. It had become a carnival of noise, tents, and chaos. Cars lined the roadside in both directions. Families dragged coolers across the grass. Teenagers set up hammocks between my fence posts, and children ran wild under banners that read, "Welcome to Maple Creek Camping Festival." Patricia stood at the center of it all like a queen overseeing her empire. Her sun hat tilted just so, her clipboard tucked neatly under one arm. She moved between the tents, pointing, gesturing, organizing. The sight would have been impressive if it weren't so infuriating. Everything about it screamed entitlement, a woman so convinced of her authority that she never considered she might be trespassing. I stayed quiet that morning, leaning against my fence, watching the spectacle unfold. It was a strange thing, seeing strangers hammer tent stakes into your soil, laughing as if they owned it. They had no idea they were inside a private property line. Patricia's flyers and confident tone had convinced them it was all approved, all legitimate. By mid-morning, the noise grew louder. Music blared from portable speakers. Someone set up a barbecue near my irrigation trench. Smoke curled into the air, mixing with the sound of laughter and shouting. It was chaos, a living, breathing organism of intrusion. And through it all, my bulls stood at the far end of the field, calm but watchful. 6 powerful creatures, their dark coats glistening under the sun, their movements slow and deliberate. They were used to the quiet, the steady hum of insects and wind, not the unpredictable sounds of hundreds of people invading their space. I had released them into the field that morning deliberately. It wasn't revenge yet. It was a reminder of reality. This was still farmland, not a park. My animals had every right to be there. They belonged, unlike the sea of tents and people now trespassing without thought. As noon approached, things began to unravel. The first sign came when a group of children, chasing each other through the grass, came too close to the herd. The bulls lifted their heads, ears flicking forward. One of them, the oldest, a massive black bull named Duke, stamped a hoof into the dirt, snorting. The children froze, wide-eyed, then ran back screaming toward their parents. That should have been the end of it. But Patricia, ever the authority, decided to handle it herself. She strutted toward the fence line, shouting instructions, waving her arms as if commanding an army. From a distance, I could see her gesturing toward the bulls, her mouth forming words I didn't need to hear to understand. She was telling them to remove the animals.